Indians like to buy gold and silver to protect their wealth. That has historically been the vehicle through which they have protected themselves. And the reason is that people of this country don't trust their government, because the moment the government gets an opportunity, the government takes away your wealth.
Welcome to the Silver Doctors exclusive interview. Today I have a guest, Mr. Jayant Bhandari, a first-time guest here on Silver Doctors. Mr. Bhandari is an investment resource analyst as well as commentator, and today he's joining us to share his thoughts on the global economy as well as the international gold market. So Jayant Bhandari, welcome to Silver Doctors.
Thanks for having me, Mike.
Well, I appreciate you taking time out of your day. I know you're in India right now, so there's a major time difference there, but I appreciate you for sitting down with me because there's a lot of things happening in that part of the world that I thought about you being my guest here, wanting to find out more in-depth information about it. So with that being the case, before we dive into some of the questions I have, share with the audience a little bit as to who Jayant Bhandari is and a little bit of your background, please.
Mike, I advise institutional investors on investing in junior mining companies. And aside from that, I also do a fair bit of writing work on economics, politics, and cultures. I travel the world all the time. Within this month, I will be in Australia, Japan, Singapore, and India. I try to understand as much about the world as I can, and I like to write about my experiences.
So, John, thank you for sharing that with us. And so, the reason I reached out to you to have you on Silver Docs because most recently I came across your recent article on the decline of India on the internationalman.com website, and it talks a lot about the current election cycle. And I remember India, if I'm not mistaken, led the way with the whole cashless society movement. And so how has that turned out for the economy now that they're heading into this presidential cycle? How has the whole cashless society been so far?
Mike, even a very small amount of thinking takes you to a situation where you realize that it is impossible for India to go cashless. Many of my relatives and friends have never used their ATM card. In fact, I never use my bank card or credit card in this country because there are so many scams happening. And at the same time, many times money leaves my bank account but never arrives at its destination. In a situation where things are so dysfunctional, how can you expect cashless society to work? And then you have to start thinking about what an uneducated person would do in a similar situation. He does not have the money, he cannot afford to lose his money, and he has no clue how internet and computers work. So this whole cashless society was going to be a failure anyway. In India today, there is more cash than there was before when they did demonetization of 86% of the currency. Which means that all of that cash, trying to make the society cashless, has turned out to be an utter failure. And in the meantime, we destroyed the informal economy. Informal economy is completely dependent on cash. And by trying to eradicate cash, we destroyed that economy. Now that economy has about 90 to 93% of the workforce of India. You can't really afford to destroy that economy and expect the economy to do well.
Understandable. Now, you mentioned that there's more cash now in circulation. So I think it was the highest denomination notes that were removed from circulation. So has they since printed smaller denominations or what, or how is there more cash now?
They actually have a higher denomination cash now. So they took away $1,000 rupee bills, and now we have 2,000 rupee bills, which actually allows for money laundering even easier, makes life easier for money launderers. So really, I don't even understand why the government did what it did. It just wanted to create a problem for, in my view, other political parties. It wanted to make a show to the middle class that government was trying to do something when it really didn't have many tools to change the economic structure of the country.
Now, since that time frame of the currency being manipulated and being taken out of circulation, let's talk a little bit about options and alternatives. And so I know that India is really rich and just culturally in gold. And so has gold sales spiked and has more people been interested in purchasing gold? And how has that worked in regards to them getting out of their own currency for alternatives?
What happened in the last 2 or 3 decades, Mike, when economic growth was happening, was that people were investing in stocks and companies and properties. Property prices are extraordinarily expensive in India. The most expensive properties in the world are not in Hong Kong, Singapore, in terms of rental yield, as they are in India. Um, and this is a product of the fact that people put a lot of their cash in property, stocks, and investments. And none of that has really turned out to be very good investment methodology for Indians. Particularly in the last 2 or 3 years, people have lost a huge amount of money in properties, and the stock market is extraordinarily expensive, in my view. The end result is that people will slowly buy an increasing amount of gold. Now, it is extremely difficult to understand what kind of buying is actually happening in the gold market in India, because a lot of gold comes via smuggling channels. It's much easier to smuggle gold from Bangladesh or Nepal or fly it from Dubai than it is to buy a legally bought gold, because legally bought gold carries a tax of about 12%. And why should you pay 12% when you have to compete with smugglers who pay no tax?
Interesting there. So along with the gold sales, and so how is other alternatives viewed in that country there, such as silver, palladium, as well as the cryptocurrency?
I am not sure about the latest to do with cryptocurrencies. A lot of youngsters were buying cryptocurrencies in the country because they think that's the way to protect their wealth, and that's the way to speculate, and that's the way to make 10 times your investment. But that's, in my view, is not going to work out. The real thing that India should invest in is gold or silver. And Indians like to buy gold and silver to protect their wealth. That has historically been the vehicle through which they have protected themselves. And remember, this country is among the biggest buyer of gold and silver. And the reason is that people of this country don't trust their government, because the moment the government gets an opportunity, the government takes away your wealth. So people will always buy gold and silver in this country.
Right, understandable there. Now let's get a little bit into your article, The Decline of India, being that there's a presidential election coming up pretty soon. And so it's quite a lengthy article, but share with us a little bit about your thoughts on India, where it has been and where it's going in the future under the leadership there.
What happened was, Mike, that India became independent from the British rule in 1947. And since that time, institutions of India has continued to degrade and decay and fall apart. And they are in an extremely difficult situation today. There is virtually no law and order situation in this country. Nothing works in this country. Institutions don't work in this country. Political and social situation is increasingly bad. The problem between Hindus and Muslims continue to increase. Hindus have become increasingly fanatic, which does not mean that Muslims were not fanatic. They were already very fanatic. So the whole situation of the country is extremely bad. And the main reason is that there is no governing structure in this country. Government, for all intents and purposes, does not exist. It exists only to steal money from the citizens. And this situation is going to keep getting worse and worse. But more than corruption, the real problem is that people who run this country don't really have the vision or imagination to keep this country together. And that is really where the biggest problem of this country lies. Social and cultural problems will continue to ramp up in this country. And my view is that this country will fall apart into smaller pieces as a product of stresses that lack of governance institutions will create in this country.
Now, how much of that is influenced by external forces? Because I know that, if I'm not mistaken, when it comes to the One Belt, One Road initiative, there's been a lot of animosity or whatnot in between China's intervention in the One Belt, One Road coming across that region there. And so how much of the internal problems are externally influenced, in your opinion?
Well, internal problems are a product of internal forces. We can't keep our own house in order, so it's easy to blame other people for our problems. Now, Pakistan is, of course, a problem. Pakistan has become an extremely fanatic country. Pakistan, in my view, is probably about 20 years ahead in terms of fanaticism compared to what India is. Now, remember, there is a woman called Asia Bibi who was facing a capital punishment order by the court because she had drunk a cup of glass of water from a Muslim well. Now, if you can get capital punishment in a country just because you drank water from a wrong place, there's something seriously wrong about your country. That is the situation with Pakistan. And very rapidly, India is going towards the same path. Now, as far as One Belt, One Road is concerned, my view is that India, instead of looking at China as an enemy, should look at China as a friend. India should try to become the back office of China. That is the best possibility, best hope for India going forward. However, Indians, and particularly the Indian government, do not like China and Chinese, and mostly for propaganda purposes because they are envious. China is 5 times richer than India is. So we have to accept that compared to India, China is a first world country. And it is our job, it is the job of Indians to actually invite China to come and manufacture in India and use the Indian infrastructure as a part of One Belt, One Road policy so that India can develop on the back of Chinese growth.
Understandable there. Now, with the One Belt, One Road initiative, the forum just ended this past weekend, and I was looking at some of the articles, and it talks about them signing on more countries to be a part of that. And so I want to look ahead to the future because I was always curious as to, what is the final objective of this One Belt, One Road initiative? What are your thoughts about that? And will that be the leader for the next great economy or monetary system or whatnot? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, most of the policies that government try to infrastructure will become a waste. What we have is a situation in which people think that you have to develop infrastructure and economic growth is start to happen. Now, the reality is exactly the opposite. It is economic growth which actually leads before infrastructural development should happen. Chinese government is trying an erroneous policy, in my view. You cannot really sell Chinese products to extremely poor countries in Africa or India or Central Asia. What China should be doing is to let the economic growth in these countries happen first before they develop infrastructure. I don't like this policy. Having said that, most of the things China is doing, I am quite in favor of those.
Right, and it looks like, especially on the African continent, that they are doing a lot of investing and trying to build up infrastructure. And so I think, as of now, it looks like there's heavy influence in the African region from China as well as Russia. And so it's just a matter of time before they are up and running it once again. And so do you see the growth that's coming from those particular regions there being the next leaders in development for the world for most part?
Mike, there isn't much hope from Africa. Africa is actually a basket case and it's getting worse and worse by the day. And people don't really want to understand that because people don't discuss Africa openly. Now, what China is doing in Africa is mostly to acquire resources for Chinese's internal purposes, and that's perfectly fine. But that is not going to result into growth of Africa because Africans will either consume it. There is really a lack of culture of saving in Africa. And if they don't consume it, their governments will steal it anyway. So really, in terms of capital investment taking place in Africa, it's not going to happen. All this basically means that Africa will not benefit from it. Now, China is developing infrastructure, claiming that it might help the local economies, and it's not going to do it because you have to build up factories, et cetera, to actually be able to exploit the infrastructure that China is developing. That infrastructure, in my view, has only one use, and that is to extract resources for Chinese purposes.
Out of all the information that you shared and everything that I'm hearing from the One Belt One Road Initiative, the United States of America is not really included or a part of any of that. And so do you think that's a way of looking ahead and just beginning to separate the world from the East into the West? Or is that a way of just saying, hey, it's time for us to move beyond, the world dominant power that the United States has had on the world for so many decades? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, if you look around the US, Chinese are everywhere in the United States these days. All you have to do is to walk out of your home and you will see a Chinese. Chinese government does not want to isolate the United States. Chinese, from what I see, like the United States, One Belt, One Road is all about setting up infrastructure where infrastructure does not exist. There's no problem with infrastructure in the United States. United States is well connected with China, so China doesn't really have to worry about it.
Now let's move a little bit towards this part of the world, United States of America. And so there's a lot of talk, especially on the GDP numbers that just came out recently, and a lot of people, saying that they're somewhat sketchy. But then also we have from the White House, we have them talking about the need for an interest rate cut. And so if we still have growth, but what's the need for a cut? What are your thoughts on that? And are those numbers something that we can rely upon?
Well, I don't know how much to rely on numbers provided by the governments, but one thing is for sure that Trump has done a lot of good for the United States. The economy in the United States is doing very well relative to what it was doing before he came into power. Also, there is a huge amount of employment increase since the time he has come to power. And people look at American dollar and American economy with much higher confidence because of Trump.
So, Jayant, in regards to the whole economy, precious metals is a major part of preserving and hedging against the things that are coming. I believe that there's a global slowdown that's underway, and who knows how that'll play out. But what are your thoughts on what the price of gold now? Can we see or expect any type of actual increase in prices anytime this year, or what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I don't know really about the price of gold, but in my view, there isn't really much option that people have today in terms of how to protect their wealth. If you try to put your money in the bank account in the United States, you get basically a 0% interest rate from your deposit. In many countries, you get negative return on your investment by keeping that money in the banking system. In countries in the third world where people consume most of the gold, the negative yield is much higher, which means that they lose a lot of their money by investing in the economy. As a result, people have an interest to buy gold and silver in these countries. And today, the world is extremely fragile politically and socially. And the only exception to that is East Asia. Most of the world is extremely fragile, and these people will have really no choice but to protect their wealth using gold and silver as the vehicle, which in my view means that both of these precious metals should increase in price because the supply is limited by the sheer fact that there's only so much gold and silver in the world at any point of time. And when people rush to buy gold and silver, the price can spike very quickly. However, my interest to buy gold and silver is mostly as an insurance.
Right. So as an insurance against currencies that are having issues. Now, I've heard people throw out all types of numbers about the amount of countries that are experiencing currency issues. Therefore, the nominal price in gold is through the roof. And so do you see that the United States of America being the last of all fiat currencies or last governments to basically have major issues? Therefore, prices around the world will increase drastically in your thoughts?
Well, they have actually continued to increase for many, many years now. Gold is trading at its highest price in many currencies, even today. When you look at gold in US dollar term, gold might not have done all that well for the last few years, but United States dollar was a cheap currency and continues to be cheap in many ways, because when I use my US dollar in the United States, I actually get much better value than I get in most other Western countries. As a result, United States dollar was and is probably still a cheap currency, and that is why a lot of people have focused their protection strategies in terms of buying US dollar, but eventually US dollar will become expensive as well, and they will start paying attention to other ways to protect their wealth.
Understandable. Well, Jayant Bhandari, it's been great having you join us here on Silver Doctors. Can you leave the audience with more ways that they can find out how to follow you and to stay in tune with what you have going on?
My website is jayantbhandari.com, and everything I do goes on that website.
Sounds good. So I'll link that down beneath this video here for those that want to find out more. But Jayant, it's always good to connect with you via interview. So thanks again for joining me here on Silver Doctors.
Thanks for having me, Mike.
Appreciate it.